Transformation of Nature in Czechoslovakia, 1948-1964, a book authored by Doubravka Olšáková and Jiří Janáč, who will be presenting it here, and I'm really very happy to have them here. And we also have as a commentator Stephen Brain from Mississippi State University. And I'm also very happy that Stephen joined us, and I hope that we'll have a discussion in which we can look at both the questions of history of science, history of environment, and also look a bit into the question of the Soviet Union in its very many various geographies, because the Stalin Plan for Nature is something which spans from Vladivostok to whatever the most western part of the Eastern Bloc was, which probably was near Prague or like Reichenberg, Liberec. So we will hopefully have in the discussion this many facets. And I'm also very happy to have so many people joining us. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I wanted just to shortly introduce our today's speakers. So Doubravka Olšáková is a senior researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History at the Academy of Sciences of the Czech Republic, where she leads now a group on the environmental history. And in her research, she worked on environmental history recently and on scientific diplomacy in the 20th century. And many other topics which I don't have to enumerate now. And Jiří Janáč, the co-author of the book, works also at the Institute for Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and at the same time at the Institute for World History at the Charles University in Prague. And he works also on environmental history of the Czech Republic, on the urban history of post-socialism, and his most recent project is devoted to the history of water and has a very enticing title, Hydrosocialism. And Stephen Brain, our commentator for today, is associate professor for history at the Mississippi State University, and he worked on environmental history of Soviet Union, or the environmental history of Soviet collectivization, and artificial environments in space, which joins environment and the space and the exploration of space. So the two very typical topic, very characteristic topic for the Soviet Union. And he also serves as an co-editor of the journal Environmental History, which is one of the main journals in our field. We also had as commentator Arnold Stenzel, who unfortunately cannot join us today. Because of it, we will have also more time for the discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. And now I will give the floor to Doubravka and Jiří to present the great book that you wrote, and which cover you see on this side of my screen. So Doubravka, Jiří, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan, very much. And thanks a lot for inviting us. It's a great opportunity to be here and deliver a very short presentation of our book, which was published in Czech, I think, in 2018, and in English 2 years later. Nevertheless, I have to say that the idea of the book as such, it means the Stalin's Plan for the Transformation of Nature, was born much more earlier. It means like 10 years ago, during my first research project when I returned to the Czech Republic, when I worked on the topic of Sovietization of East European Academies of Sciences. All of a sudden, I came across fascinating materials, archive materials, on the Stalin's Plan for the Transformation of Nature. And of course, that I knew and I heard about Stalin's plan implemented in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the fact that the plan was implemented on local level in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and in Eastern Europe was really new for me. So I started to work on it, and I started to get together all necessary materials. And my second project, research project, was on the Stalin's Plan. I invited Jiří, who is a specialist and who is specialized in the history of technology, because my idea was to combine environmental history, history of science, and history of technology. And I hope that it was more or less successful, because it is a spin-off of a project focused on institutional history and the development of academies of sciences. My agenda was much more focused on institutional history. And I have to say that it's quite visible, it's apparent in the book when you read it, that there are still traces of such an approach, despite I tried to, to adopt another point of view. And what is fascinating about the combination of the history of science and institutional history and environmental history, when we talk about Stalin's Plan and the book as such, in my opinion, is that there are issues and research objectives which returns all the time. It's the problem, the issue of continuity, discontinuity. It's the role of science in society, in communist societies, and so on. And we would like to talk about it a little bit more right now. And I'm going to share our presentation, and I hope that you will enjoy it. So just give me a few seconds. Chceme tam i ten obrázek, je jich tam, no, ten.
Asi nemusíme.
Tak, dobře, tak jo. Is it okay? Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
So
I'll start. We sort of argue that there was something like environmentalism. And indeed, the notion of environmentalism in the Stalinist period sounds to, well, many observers as a crystal clear example of contradictio in adjecto. The image of state socialism as environmentally irresponsible regime still holds firmly, built upon the legacy of environmental movements of 1970s and 1980s. This view has been perhaps best captured by the metaphor of ecocide, firmly framed within the totalitarian interpretation of socialist rule. However, recently we can observe a new trend, actually not that new, dating back to Doug Wiener's book from 1990s, emerging in environmental historiography of state socialism, which places state socialism in the context of European modernity. Rather than interpreting the communist state in totalitarian terms, this perspective proposes to understand it as some form of a social contract. This implies that instead of being controlled and directed solely by communist, Marxist, Stalinist, whatever ideology, national policies were negotiated with experts who acted as interpreters of public needs and providers of solutions. Environmentalism fits within this narrative of technocratic socialism. This perspective sheds a new light on the long discussed paradox of two phases of socialist environmentalism. Well-developed environmental science, planning and legislation on one hand, and rather dim practice. While in totalitarian narrative, this has been explained as simply a lip service, pure rhetoric of the regime, it actually seems that experts did, at least at some particular points in the history of state socialism, have a real impact and influenced decision-making.
Our approach is built up around three main assumptions. The first one is that Czech and Slovak, we should think about Slovak environmental history too when we talk about Czechoslovak history. So both histories need to be written from the late 40s forward, not backwards from its 1980s failure. The second one is that scholarship should take into account the full range of environmental actors, their initiatives, strategies, and results. Should these actors be officially acknowledged and supported by the communist regime, such as Czechoslovak Socialist Union of Youth, or act within dissident movements? It does not matter. The third one, the full picture should include institutional actors like the People's Control Committee, in Czech it's Výbor lidové kontroly, water management institutions, state hygiene or epidemiology institutes, and others that have been so far neglected, with one exception that is just sitting here, and it's Jiří Janáč, who included these actors into his work and papers.
After the communist takeover in 1948 in Czechoslovakia, environmental science, among other sciences, rose to relative prominence within the governance system. Introduced following the Soviet model developed under Soviet Stalinism. The rationale was clear. As an expert put it in 1968, people cannot gain control over the circumstances of their own lives if they do not create these circumstances. The nature of man's work, engraved in the environment in which he lives, decides about his development. Indeed, Stalinist historical materialism, based on dialectical understanding of the relationship between man and nature, understood human society as natural context. The major implication here was that planning of societal transformation had to include nature and natural resources as a dynamic component. Typical example of this is the so-called dynamic hydrology. While before that, hydrology was based on statistics, transformation of nature required development of hydrological modeling in order to enable prediction and construction of sustainable new environments. Environmental planning, geography, and other sciences has been seen as a necessary basis for any successful emancipation of man from constraints of nature. The aim was to build a new nature, new biological equilibrium in landscape, favorable to efficient exploitation and production of resources.
In line with such ideological predicaments, Czechoslovak experts in early 50s framed their views in terms of co-evolution and co-creation of natural and social. Such a cult of unity constituted a basis of local adaptation of a Stalin's plan for transformation of nature. In the early 50s, with the ultimate goal to forming the nature into the human environment. It means landscape technosphere. In Czech we say příroda, we distinguish between příroda and životní prostředí. Generally, it combined local conservationist traditions in Czechoslovakia as well as in the Soviet Union, dating back to late 19th century, but highly influential since 30s. With anti-Malthusian techno-optimistic progressivism, Stephen speaks here about two kinds of experts, conservationist technocrats and radical Prometheans, sorry. And particular technocratic method of micro and macro planning with the ultimate aim to modify the nature and climate in Eastern Europe. Local, it means local, national micro projects like shelter belts. I'm just trying to move, the presentation and it's not working. Okay, yeah. So local national micro-projects like shelter belts had been planned in order to be easily coordinated and linked to micro-projects implemented in neighboring countries, and thus creating a coordinated macro-project shaping the core problem of European population, the autarky in agricultural production. Its application in Czechoslovakia has been supervised by Soviet authorities, but without direct intervention. However, radicals among Czech experts followed the Soviet example set by Lysenko and others, compromising scientific validity and soundness of the entire in the eyes of technocracy. This is, for example, let's talk about negative attitude of water experts toward biotechnical measures of controlling environment and so on. What was the context of Sovietization? There should be another slide, yeah. Research landscape was structured in order to reflect priorities of technocratic planning. Let's mention, for example, a very short existence of the Czech Academy of Agricultural Sciences from 1952 until 1962, then Institute of Landscape Planning and Nature Protection of the Academy of Sciences, which existed from 1962 until 1971 and so on. However, short-time political agenda and suggested technocratic solutions contradict publicly promoted long-term implementation of a Stalinist plan, ideological rhetoric built on Czechoslovak political dependence on the Soviet Union. The institutional implementation of the Grand Plan was only made possible once a new scientific research institutional structure emerged. This structure was completed in 1952-1953 with the establishment of 2 academies of sciences as the highest scientific institutions in the country, based on the model of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union and Bashňu. The role of Czechoslovak Academy of Agricultural Sciences was crucial, since the political pressure on agricultural sciences was much stronger than on the biological and other sciences. Hardline Sovietization, which resulted in the dismissal of genetics and pressure to implement Maturinism, Lysenkism, and other Soviet pseudo-methods, promised quick results and the vision of growing agricultural production. Nevertheless, a certain level of continuity was kept, especially the expert continuity and a sort of institutional memory, and this continuity explains relatively quick and smooth return to science standards and recognition of global science achievements in the Czechoslovak milieu in the 60s. Economic interests and political pressure on keeping the production going and, if possible, intensify heavy industry were the main driving forces of a plan in the 50s. Who has never heard of great constructions of socialism? It was such a popular topic at that time. Nevertheless, my colleague Jiří Janáč has successfully showed the continuity of interwar plans and great constructions of socialism, which were promoted as brand new constructions. He has also successfully proved that interwar plans of great infrastructures were later implemented as a part of the Comecon agenda. This kind of hidden integration based on circulation of plans, knowledge, and projects shows that Stalinist plan was a long-term historical process, not just a matter of historical coincidence. The technocratic system of holistic spatial development of environment and society consisted of series of surveys and inventories of natural resources, soils, forests, minerals, water, and so on, including scenarios for their optimal mobilization, networks, industrial facilities or settlements. All new investments and projects were supposed to be evaluated against such guiding plans, so-called in Czech Směrný Plan, to secure a coordinated and harmonious transition to the new nature society balance based on a new harmony between man and his environment through spatial planning.
However, there were certain limits to such technocratic planning. The room for expert debates focusing on mobilization, conservation, or conservation of resources available on the national territory and their distribution remained throughout the period of inquiry, demarcated by Marxist dialectical understanding of the nature-society relationship and the Soviet model of building of socialism or communism. In practice, such technocratic environmentalism early on reached its limits on several levels. Perhaps most visible among them was the discrepancy between the policy of rapid socialist industrialization and relatively slow development of surveys and inventories necessary for really scientific planning of such industrialization. In effect, priority was clearly given to the former, partly under the pressure from the USSR. Stalinist charismatic policy of rapid construction of socialist society took the upper hand, and advocates of the Stalin's plan for transformation of nature by 1958 had bitterly noted that we have done nothing to improve the legacy of capitalist profit-oriented attitude to landscape. Instead, devastation of landscape is only getting worse since the February of 1948. Experts complain that the preference for political goals, building of material base of socialism, over technocratic planning resulted in disproportionately large investments into not properly planned construction of so-called productive forces with disastrous environmental and economic effects. Second, at least in Czechoslovak context, we can observe certain reservations towards more radical Soviet concept, for example, Lysenkoism, but also some features of dynamic hydrology and so on. Last but not least, with the fall of Stalinism, a number of initiatives associated with environmental planning and research simply faded out, later returning via UNESCO in 1970s. The Sovietization of landscape management, which was inspired by the Stalin Plan, was seemingly in conflict with the aims of nature conservation, but in the end, conservationists utilized the failure of this plan in their favor. Now to the conclusions. I think we sort of covered them already in our presentation, but just to sum it up, we argue that Stalinist plan and Stalinist environmentalism shaped not only state socialist technocratic environmentalism in its strategies and goals, but through United Nations and other organizations reached also the global level, especially Doubravka works on this topic, I think, quite extensively. The long-term legacy of Stalinist plan in Eastern Europe, if we can take Czechoslovakia as an example here, the technocratic vision of nature as something to be transformed and mastered, survived to 1989 and even today remains firmly placed on the agenda of possibly too many political parties in the region. And that's it. So thanks.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Doubravka. Thank you, Jiří. And then I give the floor to Stephen for the commentary.
Right. Very well. Yeah, thanks. You still have in mind about a 10-minute comment, is that right, Jan?
Yes, but you can easily come to a bit longer comment if you want. Okay,
very well. Well, first I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this topic. It was a couple projects ago, but I still feel connected to the topic, and it's nice to know that people are still thinking about this. I think it is an important topic. At times in the book, there's a sense of an almost apologetic sense of choosing something that is that's from an older era of historical dispute. But I still think that there's a lot of import in this topic, and so I'm glad that people are still talking about it. First, I'd like to comment name some things I think are really strong about the book, and then toward the end, I'll bring in a few critiques as well. pardon me. First of all, it's really laudable, I think, how the authors largely avoid using the topic to score points to re-adjudicate the Cold War debate. Very often, examinations of the Great Stalin Plan for the transformation of nature fall back on Cold War attitudes, and they use the Great Stalin Plan as an opportunity to ridicule the cult of personality or the Soviet effort to remake human nature. And those things are fine. I'm not saying that those are beats that historians should avoid necessarily. If we want to rehearse the Cold War arguments about liberalism and totalitarianism, then that's okay. But in truth, that debate is really over, I think, more or less. And whereas the debate about how we should interact with our environments and what governments can request of their citizens in the name of environmental quality, these are still relevant issues about as both the authors were saying earlier, the role of science in determining how to measure and perceive our environment and what kind of values we're going to use to manage the environment. Those are still active topics and very much alive today. And so while the debate between totalitarianism and liberal democracy is more or less a dead letter, the one about how we're supposed to perceive our environment is still a live one. And so I think that I really want to thank the authors for approaching it in that way, because it's appealing for Westerners, I think, to take a different approach, but more useful to look at the Great Stalin Plan in this other way. And as such, I think the book is praiseworthy because it accurately situates the Great Stalin Plan and its true significance in the post-Cold War era. As it turns out, the Great Stalin Plan did not play an especially important role in the larger arc of Soviet history. It wasn't a key turning point. It didn't effectuate change much as it reflected change in Soviet history, and it didn't really much alter the course of Cold War history. But the Great Stalin Plan should hold great interest for environmental historians because the topics and the issues raised by the Great Stalin Plan and how we evaluate it are still alive today. It asks us, as the authors note in the book, the Great Stalin Plan asks us to evaluate the Soviet technocratic attitude toward the natural world. It also asks us to evaluate Malthusianism and to what degree we should accept or reject Malthusianism. And it also asks us to think about the historical concerns and worries about climate change, because in some cases, in retrospect, some of those worries from the middle of the 20th century don't seem to be as resonant today. Some of them may be perhaps even unfounded. And so as environmental history, as a moment in environmental history, the Great Stalin Plan has a lot of things for us to muse about and to think about. And also I found it very interesting how the authors show that the Great Stalin Plan had analogous roots in Czechoslovakia, that people were thinking about similar topics outside of Russia, as they were in the United States and other places in the 1930s. And I thought that was a very useful way to put the Soviet progression in a larger historical context. And I thought it was also very interesting and laudable how it showed that despite the ideological uniformity of the era, that the Great Stalin Plan was the subject of explicit and conscious discussion. It wasn't a matter of the Czechs obediently following the Soviet order, but rather that they took it on as a matter of discussion, and it wasn't the outcome wasn't foreordained. It was still there were possibilities, and also that the Great Stalin Plan was ultimately more or less rejected on the grounds that the Czech environment was not drying up. Now, this is not to say the matter is settled. The debate about climate change at the landscape level is still going on today. But in terms of Cold War history, it shows that there was a lot more diversity and debate and difference than maybe we might assume. Now, the book's actual narrative, I think, emerges only toward the end of the volume. But when it does, it shows that the Great Stalin Plan changed entirely when exported to Czechoslovakia. And more importantly, it did not focus on afforestation, which was the centerpiece of the Great Stalin Plan. And in the longest term, the Stalin Plan changed shape, and it became part of the fabric of ordinary Czech life in the form of social organizations that are still active today. And so I thought the really strong part was showing how a scientific and industrial initiative from the Soviet Union changed when it left the Soviet borders, how it was reimagined and reshaped and repurposed by the people in the Warsaw Bloc, and then how it even persisted in different ways. And I thought all that was really interesting to show how an initial initiative could change shape and change form as it moved around the globe. But I'd like to make also a few critiques, because I think that in some places the book sometimes takes Soviet propaganda at face value, and therefore important some things which seem more to contrast more with the Soviet experience may not contrast as sharply as it might seem if a fuller picture is kept in mind. Some of the crucial works on this subject are not mentioned in the bibliography or in the body of the text. A recent analysis by Oldfield and Shaw is absent, and my works are also absent from the bibliography. And this is not so much a matter of academic etiquette as a matter of substance, because some of the high Stalinist propaganda about the Great Stalin Plan is taken at face value, when in fact, the Great Stalin Plan had a more complicated origin story than one might guess from looking at what the Soviets said about it after August of 1948. And that Soviet backstory is somewhat neglected here. Most importantly, the authors sometimes, not always, but sometimes conflate the Great Stalin Plan with Stalinist economic development as a whole. And there are points of contact between the Great Stalin Plan and between Stalinist rapid industrialization, but the two phenomena are distinct, and each has its own history and its own motivations and its own outcomes. And the conflation of the Great Stalin Plan with Soviet rapid industrialization is common in the literature about the Great Stalin Plan, but the conflation is unfortunate for a number of reasons. The Czech interaction with the Great Stalin Plan contrasts quite strongly with Soviet propaganda and with predominant historical assessments of the high Stalinist period, but the contrast with Soviet reality is not so stark, and it's more complicated. To wit, the Great Stalin Plan had only three components: shelter belts, reservoir construction, and grass planting. And all of these aspects were focused on one thing, that is hydrology, which is sometimes apparent in the volume and sometimes not. The Great Stalin Plan was focused on industrialization only in the most indirect sense, because foresters argued that Soviet hydrological plants were threatened if the hydrological regime was unstable. And I should be mentioned in passing that the backstory of the Great Stalin Plan in the Soviet Union was based upon the fact that foresters believed that the forest was imperiled in the Soviet Union and were looking for a way to push for afforestation, and they've been trying throughout the 30s to do so with only limited success. But when they found that, landed upon this argument about danger to the hydroelectric plants, then they were able to get a lot more support for afforestation at the upper levels of the government. So unlike Stalinist rapid industrialization, the Great Stalin Plan did not seek to maximize industrial output, and it didn't share much with the White Sea Canal idea that humans in transforming nature are transformed. The Great Stalin Plan contrasts rather strongly with the Great Socialist Project of the 1930s, both in its origins and in its intentions. And to conflate these two things, to say the Great Stalin Plan is just an arm of Stalinist industrialization, I think is misleading and can lead to some inaccurate conclusions. More importantly, the Great Stalin Plan, despite its name, was designed to restore Russian hydrology rather than transform it. The plan was fundamentally conservative, maybe even reactionary, because it was devised in the forest bureaucracies of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and it became a plan to transform nature only when it was rebranded in the fall of 1948. After it was named, the motivation changed. But even after it was named, the motivation was still restorative, to restore the Russian landscape rather than transform it. It was a plan to make it as it had been before agricultural development had changed the landscape. In a way, Stalinist rhetoric was stolen to generate enthusiasm for what was a backward-looking program. And it's worth mentioning here very briefly that despite all of the problems, and there were many with this Great Stalin Plan in the Soviet Union, the Great Stalin Plan apparently worked, not in that it transformed the climate of European Russia, but in that it moderated the microclimates of the collective farms where the new forests were established. And third, I think at times in the volume, Lysenkoism is made more central to the Great Stalin Plan than he really should be. Lysenkoism, as I described in my works on the subject, was not really part of the Great Stalin Plan until after its announcement. When Lysenko realized that a major governmental initiative was launching, and I should say a major environmental initiative was launching without his input or his influence, and because of his perceived role in Soviet science, he couldn't have that. He was able to use his power at the time to force a kind of Maturinism onto the Great Stalin Plan, thereby ensuring its failure, as I described also. But Lysenkoism is not of the Great Stalin Plan's essence, nor are monocultures or the tendency to ignore local conditions. When the plan emerged, planners were careful to recommend a different blend of species for each location. And those instructions were more or less steamrolled, if you will, by Lysenko, and when his hastily drummed up additions to the Great Stalin Plan's instruction. Although technocratic, the Great Stalin Plan did not seek to conquer nature. Rather, it represented another example of the Russian approach to attempt to work with nature to achieve desirable results. So just in summary, the Great Stalin Plan is sometimes used as an exemplar of all that was wrong with the Soviet project: its gigantomania, its ideological uniformity, and its blithe assertions that human will was all-powerful if organized properly. And these tendencies of Soviet power had negative consequences on the Soviet populace and the environment. But I think it's a mistake to conflate the Great Stalin Plan with Stalinism, despite the obvious similarity in the names, and to ascribe the worst aspects of Stalinism to the Great Stalin Plan, because the Great Stalin Plan did not emerge among the ideologues in the Bolshevik Party. It rather was devised by technocrats in the Soviet forest agencies in the 1930s, whose values and priorities were very different from the Stalinists. When placed in the context of Soviet history or Cold War history, the Great Stalin Plan illustrates that there was more ideological and scientific diversity in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Bloc than historians sometimes recognize. But when placed in the context of environmental history, the Great Stalin Plan illustrates that technocratic approaches to the environment can prove effective, although the benefits of technocracy accrue to the collective, while individuals pay the costs, because technocrats focus on the societal level as a rule. Furthermore, the Great Stalin Plan shows that technocracy can very easily be hijacked by stronger political forces, and in the process be misshaped beyond recognition. Okay, those are my comments. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for decentralizing the Great Stalin Plan and making it more concrete. And now I would like to ask Doubravka and Hira to your reaction to the comment.
So thanks, Stefan. Thanks a lot. I think that of course you are right, and what we really tried to draft for the very first time in Eastern Europe, I think in East European historiography, it was just a brief history of, in my opinion, of a certain vision, of a certain communist vision of how to transform nature. So, and I think that the idea behind the book was to show that there are plenty of local Stalin's plan for a transformation of nature, which is the fact that we, especially in East European historiography, still forget about, because we focus on the Soviet Union and on the Soviet policy, and local policy and national policies disappear from our perspective. So yes, you are absolutely right. And the comparison between the Soviet policy and Czech policy, Polish policy, Hungarian policy, Yugoslav policy, Yugoslav transformation, it would be such a fascinating topic. But it's so difficult to raise interest among historians of, of Cold War, as you mentioned, or of communist regimes. It's so difficult. So it was our invitation how to approach it, and just to show that there is a lot of research objectives, and there is a very rich research agenda that should be developed and worked on. About the technocracy, you are absolutely right, and I think that Jira would like to comment on it more precisely, and I would like to focus on what you mentioned about experts and continuity and discontinuity.
So it's my turn now. Well, thanks for great comments, Stephen. I have to agree that we did indeed not look enough into the origins of the Stalin Plan, but that was not really our purpose. And it was a mistake. That's true right now. You're right. We should do that. We should have done that. We looked into how it was implemented and let's say incorporated within the Czech context or Czechoslovak context. And while the story was quite different in USSR, when it arrived in Czechoslovakia, it was really conflated with the broad attempt to build communist society or socialist society. So even the bureaus, the institutions established to promote the Stalin's plan did oversee industrial constructions. The idea was that Czechoslovakia is such a small country that it could be possible to really plan it to a very to an inch. Really, each detail could be planned, and therefore they decided to, let's say, conflate or mix the industrial development with the Stalin's plan. So really build the nature anew, so that it serves the industrial potential of the country. And so it's actually the experts talking. It's not me who would conflate these two, it's them. But of course, you're right. And I think I mentioned it also in the presentation that it did not work. And from the beginning, there was this tension between the industrialists and the more enthusiastic environmentalists. So that's one reaction. This, I think, also refers to Lysenkoism, that indeed there were not that many experts in this country, and they sort of tried to negotiate what would the shape of Stalinist transformation of the country look like. And I don't know if they just tried to gain relevance for themselves by mixing Lysenkoism with Stalinist plan with shelter belts, just to show that it's really the proper Soviet way how to do things. It could be that way, but it seemed that but it was then who conflated these various approaches, which were perhaps more in conflict in the USSR than when they were imported in the context.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the continuity of experts, which could probably explain or provide an explanation of why we have not provided much more details about the origins of a Soviet plan. Because as a matter of fact, the Stalin's plan came as a brand new communist project in a new communist society after the communist takeover. And what is fascinating, it's the fact that some of the most of great experts in biological sciences who studied in Cambridge and who brought who brought to Czechoslovakia, to the interwar Czechoslovakia, new methods and approaches from the UK and from the US, became principal promoters of the Stalin's plan. I'm talking, for example, about the first president of the Czechoslovak Academy of Agricultural Sciences, Antonín Klečka, who really studied the sociology of biological of plants in Cambridge, and then became the first president promoting of the Czechoslovak Academy of Agricultural Sciences, promoting Lysenkoism, and he was one of the biggest promoter of Lysenkoism in Czechoslovakia. And then in the 80s, he was very well known. He was very active in nature protection. So this is a carrier to discovering, all kinds of not only political regimes, but also a lot of scientific revolutions, we would perhaps say, and we wanted to show that the level of continuity was probably that the continuity as such was stronger, or was stronger, but also much more dynamic. So this is about experts. On the other hand, we have experts who represent the guarantee of continuity, and then we have political regimes and political support. And this is what coincided with the launch of Stalin's plan in 1948. But we should not forget about the fact that the plan and the agenda for the whole plan was ready in 1952. It means quite late, and was supposed to be implemented from 1953 onwards. It means the beginning of the implementation was overlapped with the early process of de-Stalinization. I mean, when the cult of Stalin, faded, and it became a real problem because of political processes that were launched in Eastern Europe. Because, for example, Josef Smrkovský, the principal political representative of Stalin's plan, was arrested, and then the principal person in charge of the implementation of Stalin's plan is arrested. Then the plan as such, becomes quite problematic and a very fragile political topic. So, and in my opinion, and it was not probably sufficiently addressed in the book, it was the problem of how to negotiate, how experts saved the situation and negotiated, their ideas of the transformation of nature on the basis of political support, against the grounds of political support. So this is about this is about experts and so on. Thanks for your comments regarding Cold War attitudes. I was really, pleased to hear them, because it was exactly the purpose of the book, to show that it's not just a list of topics like Soviet propaganda and I don't know, everything that you just enumerated, but that it should be taken quite seriously and without traditional cliches. So it was our aim. So thanks for noticing it. About bibliography, so there is a lot of mistakes and faults, and I think that it's our fault. It's not that we have not read your book. But
I think it's actually mentioned somewhere in the book, but
yeah, but not.
Yeah,
it is. I don't want it to be about me though. I mean, that was a moment of egotism. It's mentioned in the book, absolutely. Please, we don't have to remain on that.
Yeah. And what else? What do we do? Soviet industrialization.
Yeah, that's what I talked about. I mean, it's the chronology is different, and the Stalinism arrives as a complete sort of contested but sort of complete package, and it includes social transformation, nature conservation, and industrialization, and all these three parts are actually discussed as being components of a new policy for the state, a new policy to, let's say, recreate the nature balance, the nature society balance on the new level to enable, let's say, better or more efficient use of natural resources. And to, so this conflation just it was there. I mean, it's in the archives. When you read the papers, it's discussed there.
Nevertheless, you share the same opinion as Paul Josephson. When we talked about the book as such, he asked a question, but why do you want to include Stalin, the industrialization? It is not a part of a Stalin's plan for the transformation of nature. And I really think that Stalin's plan for the transformation of nature is, a very special Soviet plan. We simply wanted to describe a new project of a new society. And that's why we really decided to include everything that was actually at that time considered a part of Stalin's plan for the transformation of nature. So that's how it happened. What I think is really fascinating about national histories of Stalin's plan for transformation of natures in Eastern Europe, it's the distinction between micro level and macro level. That's what you mentioned as well. And I think it's really important because you can see in archive documents and in official papers, you can see and read the frustration of small East European countries that were claiming that we know that we are so small that we cannot deliver, have the same results as the great Soviet Union. But when we work together and we start a real cooperation and we combine all local initiatives and coordinate them, it was the first conference in Sofia in Bulgaria, then we can reach the same level of, I don't know how to say it, of cooperation or of production as the Soviet Union. So it was a sort of challenge, small East European countries and the Soviet Union. And you can see a certain competition between who is going to be the best scholar and the best student. Anything else you want to mention?
Well, I think we covered all.
Yeah.
Stephen's
Otherwise,
points.
yeah, I agree with you that Lysenkoism is really overestimated as a part of the intellectual agenda of the Soviet Union. But I think because it's such a fascinating scientific topic from a point of view of a history of science, this is certainly. Yes, so I think that that's it from our side.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as a historian of science, I would also say, I think if we look at the literature about the Soviet Union, then I don't know, certainly 70% of the literature is dealing with Lysenko. So this is like a very preeminent figure also. And then there is a, because there is so much literature, there is so much new literature and so on and so on. So this is how he grows in importance post factum. Yeah, now I would like to open the floor for questions. So whoever has a question can raise a hand virtually or write a Q in the chat so that we and then you can ask a question in person online. And while you are thinking about the questions, I maybe ask. We actually already have a question by Mark Elliott. So Mark, please.
You're muted.
So it seems not to be a problem of a Zoom, but a problem of your hardware, because the Zoom says that you are unmuted, but we still don't hear you.
Okay.
Now we hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry for that. Jan, I wanted to say that please go ahead with your question. I can wait. You go, just ask you.
Oh, no, please go first, because I mean it's always good as a chair to have a question. You know.
Okay.
When there are no more questions.
Okay. So I had the chance to read the book and to write a review of the book, and so it's great to listen to Doubravka now many years after the book came out, and to have these reminiscences of the book and the influence it had in these years on our understanding of how Lysenko went global and went outside of the Soviet Union. So it was a great read. So the book was a great read for me, showing that Lysenko as a figure, so went beyond the Soviet Union. That was, we knew that it was discussed in the West and so on, but exactly what was his influence in Central Europe was not known. So this was a great contribution on that point for me. And what struck me reading the book is that actually the plan, the Stalin's plan, meaning the plan to build shelter belts, as Stefan just explained, and ponds and so on, that this was not so central for Central Europe. Maybe for reasons of dryness, that Central Europe is not that dry, so you don't actually need all of this. Maybe Hungary in the Puszta, but in other places you really don't need that, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland. So that could be an explanation for that. But so the plan is just a name for a bunch of changes that happen in Central Europe, and that happen together with a great shake-up of science and scientific institutions. That was for me especially interesting. So the changes that you had in science at the turn of the 1930s in the Soviet Union, they happen at the end of the 1940s in Central Europe. So all of this goes together. So the changes in the crackdown on scientific institutions, and changes that seem to be imported from the Soviet Union. And then the main, the central point of the book, in my view, is that actually they imported something from the Soviet Union that had probably nothing to do with the Stalin's plan as applied or as imagined in the Soviet Union first, and then they took ideas, they took visions, and they adapted them to their own conditions. So in a sense, this is a traditional narrative of a technological transfer that has more to do with adaptation than with adoption. So adoption means adapting, changing, transforming the technological system that is imported. So I found that very important in the book, and one of a question I had reading the book is exactly what was the role of these Soviet advisors that were residents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, and had to export the plan. So what do you have information on that? In the book, there's very little on that. So what did they do, these advisors? That would be great to know more on that. And a thing is, the last point is, so at the same the Stalin's plan, you can handle the Stalin's plan on two scales. You can say the Stalin's plan is this smaller plan of building shelter belts and ponds, and then and having travapolier on the fields. Or you can say this is as well the building of hydroelectric plants and dams, and as well the development of irrigation, because these three things happens exactly at the same time at the end of the 1940s. So you have a great leap forward in matters of irrigation. You have both in the Northern Caucasus and in Central Asia and Southern Caucasus, and you have as well the construction of these big these big works of socialism, the cascades, the dam cascades on the Volga, the dam cascades on the Don, and so on. So what they call the plan in Central Europe is any amount of measures taken from one of these three big measures taken in the Soviet Union. So and then you have new things that were not part of any of the three plans, and that's the funny thing. That's the funny part. For instance, acclimatization of fruits, the planting of the Russian dandelion, citruses in Hungary, rice in Poland, cotton in Czechoslovakia. I don't see anything that parallel that in the Soviet Union at the same time. Maybe in the 1930s, but not in the 1940s, as far as I know. So where does it come from? I mean, why was that the plan, the Stalin's plan? What was it on, just more generally the idea of nature transformation, transformationism, and interventionist into nature? This is Lysenko's idea, because Lysenko, the Lysenko initial interest is for acclimatization of plants. So is it his move, so Lysenko's move, or why? Why did they try to do these crazy things that were not part of the Stalin plan? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark. And now Doubravka, you can answer to all the questions or one of the questions which was asked by Mark.
Yeah, okay. So the first one was about the role of Soviet advisors and who employed them, how they worked in Czechoslovakia, and so on. So as far as I'm informed, there were Soviet advisors active at the Ministry of Agriculture, who were in charge of setting up a new institutional landscape for agricultural research, sorry. Their role was to implement the structure of Soviet Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Their role was to set up priorities in terms of principal scientific and research institutions that were supposed to become so-called leaders in agricultural sciences and agricultural research. And I think that there was the same group of Soviet advisors in technology at Ministry of Industry.
Actually, yeah. I will add something after you finish.
Okay, I'm
my turn. Okay, so there were advisors at the beginning. There was a huge debate about what's the proper Soviet way towards how to approach the transformation towards socialism. And therefore, many experts try to secure their positions by inviting more and more advisors. And some of them were sent by the USSR, but mostly they were invited by the Czech institutions and Czech experts. as sort of supervisors of proper application of Soviet model. And in some strategic sectors, of course, they were really like agents of the USSR. But in other sectors, such as agriculture and hydrology, they were really invited by the Czech experts. And for instance, in relation to the Stalin's plan, the official plan developed by the special governmental committee, which was called the Plan for Improvement of Forestry, Water Management and Agriculture. This plan was actually sent to USSR to an expert who then came to Prague and give them something like 10 pages long document, which basically said, well, it's fine. And then he get back to USSR, and no one ever talked about his involvement anymore, with an exception of the leader of the committee, who used this expert Soviet position as an argument in favor of the fulfillment of the plan. But yeah, that's how it works. So.
Yes, I agree more or less. It was really a different position, a position that really differed from Soviet advisors invited by political representatives and Communist Party, which were in charge of, political processes and so on in 50s. And the second question was about the problem of acclimatization and new plants such as rice in Czechoslovakia and cotton and I don't know what else. So the agenda behind the import of new plants was the economic autarky of socialist countries, where you really needed, of communist countries, where you really needed, and where they wanted to become independent on imports. Nevertheless, after a few years, it came out that they spent more on the problems of acclimatization, as you mentioned, of new plants than on earning independence. So it was the first reason, and that's it. I think something. No.
Not much about that. That's your stuff.
No, yeah, that's my stuff. Thanks. So so I think that the main driver was to become independent on imports. Nevertheless, when I was really, and this is also fascinating about environmental history and in 50s, 60s, and about Stalin's plan, when I was looking for former rice fields in South Moravia, I really contacted local agricultural chiefs of coop farms who were in charge of coop farms in 60s. And I asked them about where should I look for these rice fields. And they told me I have never ever heard of anything like this. It has, where do you come, where did you find this kind of information? And I told them, I showed them, the archive materials and so on. And they told me, oh, I know where is it, but, oh, really? And as a matter of fact, it was only 10 years before they started to, be active in the same local coop farm. So it's a matter of local history and local memory, which is somehow projected to the national and to collective memory on the level of nation, because we forgot completely about the Stalin's plan for the transformation of nature, and we have no idea where to look for shelter belts if you, when I was traveling in western part and Western Bohemia with my colleague from Czech broadcast, and he showed me shelter belts, he was not, he didn't know the history of it. They notioned it, they noticed it when, you know, they were driving in the region, but they were not aware of the fact that it has something to do with the Stalin's plan, that it's a result of the Stalin's plan. And yeah, just 2 remarks, sorry. No.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
So there is a question in the chat, and before asking the question, I might ask my question because it's links to the question of experts. I was wondering exactly because there was experts and there was also some, you know, as you mentioned, meetings among the Comecon and also, you know, from the 50s. I was wondering whether this local developments of the Stalin's Great Plan in Czechoslovakia did have any influence on the plan as imagined or practiced in Russia, in Soviet Russia, or in other regions of Eastern Europe. Or whether there was like really unidirectional flow of information happening here. Especially, I mean, I do understand that you didn't have a look at the Soviet archives or the Russian archives, but maybe you know something. And the second part of the question is whether there is because of these conferences which you mentioned, whether there is the conference in Sofia, which you mentioned especially, which is it, I mean, for a non-expert in Soviets, in Eastern Bloc, is it a new version of internationalism which is appearing there, or is it linking to a version of internationalism which was already present? So are these conferences a new form of cooperation, or is it something already traditional?
Sorry, what was your first question?
Or whether there was some flow of information from Czechoslovakia to Russia, to Soviet Russia.
Well, I cannot say that I've come across anything like that in the archives. So it's really unidirectional, and well, that's all from my part. But it might be because I haven't looked for that specifically. That I think actually that some of the experts in working within the framework of the Czechoslovak Stalin's plan actually, as we discussed already, did things differently than in the USSR. But I don't think that there was any recognition of that on the Soviet part. They were simply not interested, it seems to me. That was my impression from even the presence of the advisors who just, you know, waved it and said, okay, go, but did not really look into the Czechoslovak project. So I don't think that they were interested in what Czechs might have to say.
And I would like to perhaps add that, of course, we are talking about a kind of political feedback which was not present, and that's why we have not come across any kind of archive documents. Nevertheless, again, if we adopt the perspective of a history of science, and we know something about networking and the circulation of knowledge and how it works, the migration of knowledge. So on the level of really local reports, it means, you know, when you draft a report from your business trip, then you can find a few points that when, for example, a Soviet expert suggested to implement this kind of approach or this method or and so on and so on. Nevertheless, it very often remained on the level of experts and was not officially acknowledged as a part of, you know, official feedback or official agenda to be implemented on the basis of Czechoslovak experience. At that time, it was not possible, not yet, in my opinion. So it's my first point, and I liked very much your question about scientific cooperation in Eastern Europe, in small East European countries, because it raises a very important question of scientific internationalism during the Cold War and in the Soviet bloc, within intra-Soviet bloc. And I would call it, I would love to adopt what Julia Lajos is using for, I think, the history of technology, and it's restricted internationalism, or I'm not sure if I'm just correct, but it was a sort of coordinated scientific cooperation. It was not a free scientific cooperation and free exchange of ideas. Nevertheless, it was coordinated and it was restricted by ideological frameworks and so on. Nevertheless, the cooperation as such was promoted and was a part of a scientific agenda. And when we worked on our paper on the 1971 symposium of UNESCO on environmental problems in Prague, it was just, you know, the pre-conference to Stockholm conference. So we used the term of decisive absence of a Soviet Union. That, you know, played a very crucial role in international cooperation in environmental sciences during the Cold War. And I think that in the Stalin's plan and in the coordination of a Stalin's plan in Eastern Europe in 50s and 60s, we can see the big, oh, that's a long question. We can see a beginning of such an approach of, you know, a decisive absence of the Soviet Union in science agenda and scientific agenda. So yes, it was a kind of restricted cooperation, restricted internationalism.
And if I may add something, if I'm not mistaken, you also asked if there was some sort of continuity between, let's say, older and the networks built within the framework of Stalin's plan. I've looked into the hydrologists, and their workings, and they were the same guys who met in the 30s, who then worked for the Nazi Reich in the 40s, and then they met in the Comecon, within the Comecon network in the 50s. So, well, people from Czech Republic, from Czechoslovakia, people from Hungary and Poland, these were well, at least 20-30% of them were still the same guys. Yeah. So there was some sort of continuity, but it was not institutional, but personal continuity.
Mm.
Thank you so much. So now I can continue with the question which was in chat by Nella. So if I may ask, although Lysenko was not as important figure as history of science likes to make him seem, do we see any places in Czechoslovakia where his ideas were implemented? As far as I understand, in the Czechoslovakia, his ideas were influential for a rather short amount of time and mostly among geneticists rather than agriculturally minded figures.
In the Czech Republic, yes, sure, sure. He was a part of official biology, communist biology in 50s, officially until 1964, and then he disappears all of a sudden. Nevertheless, again, from oral history, we know that despite there were some professors that we as historians of science acknowledge as Lysenkoist professors, they very often taught their students traditional genetics and traditional biology. So the role of Lysenko was or could be just, you know, I don't know.
Rhetoric.
Rhetoric
it was a
figure.
sort of a vehicle how to look more Soviet in a way.
Yeah. And regarding the practical agenda, I know about experiments and about small research projects implemented on the basis of Lysenko's theories in the Institute of Microbiology, and they were not successful. What a surprise. And there is also one personal tragedy when the wife of one of principal investigators of microbiology at that time, and a very famous scientist, Ivan Malek. So his first wife was really so devoted to Lysenko and his theories that when this kind of experiments didn't work, so she committed a suicide, because she was really so convinced that Lysenko was right, and that and she realized that she was false. So there's a question about Lysenko, but it was for a very short. Unofficially, it was for a very short period. Officially, it lasted until 1964-65. And then the second long question. Do you want to read it, Jan?
Yes, I will read it. So the question is from Nick Barron. So my interest in the Great Stalin Plan is as a historian of Soviet maps and the visual culture of Soviet cartography. The Great Stalin Plan in the USSR, as you know, was accompanied by a massive propaganda effort, including many impressive and some quite beautiful posters, featuring Stalin as a map maker or as a divine draftsman. So Stephen's work, of course, has used a lot of these wonderful posters, and I think you include also a poster of Govorkov in your talk. Mm-hmm. It is perhaps largely because of this propaganda that the Great Stalin Plan is conventionally or simplistically subsumed into Stalinism in all its aspects. So the question is then whether the Czechoslovak Stalin Plan was accompanied by a similar large-scale propaganda campaign, and if so, what were its main tropes?
Yeah, well, I actually spent quite a lot of time trying to find out a set of posters devoted directly to the Stalin's plan, and in Czechoslovakia, and I failed. So apparently there were not that many posters, but again, I think the plan was part of the broader effort at transforming Czechoslovakia, and as such, it did not receive so much support, propagandistic support. But it was, put on the same footing, or put us on the level with the socialist industrialization, with building of new cities, with the construction of dams and so on. But in general, I think that the hydropower received much more attention, and the big structures of communism received much more attention in propaganda than let's say the proper Stalin's plan. That means afforestation, shelter belts, new agricultural products, and so on.
Thank you. So Doubravka, you don't want to add anything there?
No, maybe just a short remark that during the Stalin's plan for transformation during 50s, there was, and thanks to great constructions of communism, socialism in Czechoslovakia, a sort of socialist reportage, a very famous journalist style, writing style was born. And it was about the visual representation, big photography, and very short text describing photos, and the journalist describing, making reportage about socialist constructions, and it was a very famous style, writing style, which influenced the generation of 60s and especially of 60s. So just a short remark.
Thank you. So since the time is progressing, there would be the last possibility for everyone to ask questions. Also, Stephen, if you have more questions, then this would be the time to ask them, or if you want to react to what was said so far.
Yeah, it does appear there's no questions outstanding, so I don't want to take the time from anyone else who has a question. It does seem important that the timing of the Stalin Plan in the two respective countries, it comes right toward the end of the high Stalinist period, but it comes right at the beginning of communist Czechoslovakia, and so I think that they kind of serve to have two different purposes, really. Where in the Soviet Union, it's a backward-looking consolidation of victories, if you will. Whereas in the Czech, from what the book says and what you're saying today in the talk, is that in the Czech instance, it's a launching point. It's a point for a kind of a mission statement, a place for Czechoslovakia to go, a plan for to go into the future. Whereas in the Soviet Union, the Stalin Plan is a way to bring back restore the past while keeping many of the gains made by Soviet industrialization. And as such, although they have a lot in common, when they're put in the context of the histories of the two countries, then they serve very different roles. Do you think that's something that occurred to me when I was reading your book, and also now that we're in the discussion? Do you think that's important to understanding the plan of the two countries as their temporal position in the histories of the two countries?
I think so.
Well, if I get the question right, which I'm not sure about, you're actually asking how the perception, or well, could you rephrase it a bit for me? I'm sort of...
Yeah, sure. My question is, it seems to me, after reading the book and hearing the discussion, that the plans, the way that the plans unfolded, and also the way that they were presented to the public, were different, because in the Soviet instance, the plan was publicized in 1948 toward the end, after the end of Soviet industrialization, and toward the end, he didn't know it yet, but toward the end of Stalin's life, toward the end of the Stalin period. And as such, it was a way to try to consolidate Soviet accomplishments. It was a way to look to the past and to try to solidify industrialization while also bringing back some of the Soviet the Russian landscape. Whereas it had a completely different political objective in Czechoslovakia. The coup had just occurred in Czechoslovakia. They were launching a new country. And as such, the Stalin Plan there was meant to be a way to accomplish the goals of the future. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was a way to solidify the accomplishments of the past. And as such, even though they have similar objectives, they're very different in terms of what they were supposed to do in a historical context. That's where I hope that's clear. I'm not sure. I'm still thinking this myself, but it was for Russians living in the Soviet Union, the Stalin Plan was supposed to bring something back that maybe had been lost, whereas it had a completely different objective in the Czech context. It was supposed to look to the future and show what the country was going to do going forward.
Yeah, well, I can only agree. I mean, indeed, in Czech context, it was seen as a part of the great transformation. So it was not, there were, of course, the tropes copied from the Soviet propaganda, the tropes about correcting the failures of the profit-oriented capitalist use of nature and blah, blah, blah. But they were not that prominent, actually. The most prominent argument was we need to build the new balance of nature and industry and society. we need to recreate the country. Our country is small enough to do it properly. If properly planned, we can really create some sort of, well, they did not use that word, but I don't have any better word, sustainable, let's say, balance between the two. So yeah, it was really forward-looking enterprise in Czechoslovak context.
Yes, I agree, and I think that if I understand it correctly, it also opens the question of synchronicity and asynchronicity in comparison of a Soviet agenda and East European agenda or agenda of East European countries. Using the same term does not mean that we are comparing same historical phenomena. Really important to realize, and maybe that's why despite in Eastern Europe we still speak the same language, that's why the East European historiography remains so fragmented, because it does remain so fragmented, very fragmented, which is a big problem when you try to work on a larger scale. So the problem of synchronicity, asynchronicity is still present, and I think, and I'm quite happy just, you know, that you mentioned the issue, because it's quite clear when you read the book that it's about Stalin's plan, but it's not about Stalin's plan at the same time.
Well, not about the proper Stalin's plan.
And not about the proper Stalin's plan.
Thank you, Doubravka. Thank you, Jiří. And maybe now it is a good time for the closing statements. And maybe then you can also include in your closing statement the answer to the question that Nelly.
Thank you. One more question. Okay. If you don't mind, where would you see your research heading next?
Nella asked which is part of the team tied to it that you felt should be looked into next based on your findings in the book.
And does Nella mean our research or her research?
I think it's.
I would say that you could go either way. Honestly, I'm quite interested in this. It's a very curious topic for sure. But yeah, I'm really interested in where you see this headed next, because it feels like you've done a lot of pretty amazing work here. So yeah.
I think this question is for Jira, who is working on hydrosocialism, which is just, you know, a follow-up to, well, I would say it's just a follow-up to, you know, but it's up to you, Jira.
Well, it's sort of follow-up to this process, but it has a, I think, broader connotation, but my project looks into how water was sort of central to the idea of building socialism and the idea of planning nature and planning society throughout 50s, 60s, and even 70s in the Czechoslovak context. So it brings back the echoes of the Stalin's plan even in the 70s, and it's actually for the first time since late 1950s that some people even refer to the Stalin's plan openly, or at least to the work which was done within the Stalin's plan. So that's what I work on, and again I see a lot of continuity and synchronicity, and also let's say desynchronicity. What would be the asynchronicity with the development in the USSR? Which looked, let's say, other way at some points. So, yeah.
And I think that, or for example, what I found interesting, and we had not enough time and energy to go into details. It's, for example, the animal history under communism. The breeding policy under communism, which is also about international cooperation, about, you know, about creating new local national breeds, about protecting genophones, and so on. So it's a very important question, which is also quite important for current discussions on, again, genetic autarky in animal protection, in animal policy, and so on. So this is one of very interesting topics which we came across. And what I'm right now working on, so it's on scientific cooperation in environmental history in 70s and 80s on global level. So, and it's about Soviet Union, Soviet policy, Soviet science policy, Soviet science diplomacy. Nevertheless, I would like to return to more environmental history in the future. I hope so.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to bring maybe one very last thing, which I several years ago in an exhibition in Zachęta in Poland, I saw a small brochure about a connection between Czechoslovakia and Trieste, I think it's Trieste, in Adria port. It should be a tunnel, like 400 kilometers. I see that you already laughing. And I thought until a few minutes ago that it was actually a fake project, an artistic project. And now I realize that apparently it was really a project of the time from the 60s, which also then brings back exactly the question of water, but also of a long-standing longing of Czechs to have their direct connection to the sea. And this is also a very interesting project, which brings maybe not Stalinism, but still the socialist utopias and kind of long-standing ideas, which also could be probably very well made into a very interesting book, also probably connecting to the imaginaries and utopias. So with this image of Czechoslovakia being connected directly to Trieste, I wanted to conclude this very great meeting. And thank you very much once more to Doubravka and Jiří, both for the book and for the presentation of the book. And thank you, Stephen, for your great comments. And thanks everyone for joining us and for asking your questions. And if you are interested more into the questions of cooperation between different countries in Central and Eastern Europe, then you can follow HPS.CESEE. Since you got here into the Zoom meeting, you already know where it is, because in all the announcement there was an email, there was an address of it. And one of the ideas which we have behind this project, behind this platform, is exactly to connect historians working on and working in Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And as I saw from the list of today's participants, we are quite good at it. And with this, I wanted to say thank you once more and hopefully see you on our further meetings. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for a great comment. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jan.
Absolutely. Hope to see you soon in real life.
We hope so. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.